Okay. Okay, let's start. You hearty and hardy Friday people, and so I'll remind you, and I will also email the whole class. Remember, next week we have sections meet as usual, no change, but lecture is Monday and Friday next week. And then we move into what is hypothetically normal. As you know, there's no normal, but that whatever normal there's going to be is going to start a week from this coming Monday. Okay, so I will see you Monday, not Wednesday, yes, Friday. All right, and today, remember I said last time that the area of socialization is this old and people thought sleepy field, and it is now the center of exploding levels of new knowledge and new thinking. It's come right back into the center of sociology, and let me just tell you, I know most of you don't care about sociology's internal issues as a field, but I'll just say the very last slide on this lecture, which I'm actually not going to talk about, introduces the name of someone named Pierre Bourdieu, B-O-U-R-D-I-E-U, and he introduced the term cultural capital into American sociology, and it sort of floated out into the world. So even if you've never heard of him, you might have heard of that term. And he has a concept many sociologists think they know how to use, which is the term habitus, H-A-B-I-T-U-S. And it is a term that is meant to embody a radically new understanding of what it is socialization does. So old-fashioned sociologists studied socialization. Contemporary sociologists would use a term like habitus to refer to everything people internalize from their social environment. At some point, I will try to explain the differences. But for right now, I just want to say that was just the first step. Bourdieu's work started to enter American sociology in the 1980s, and it has grown in influence enormously, and actually Berkeley is one of the centers. Bourdieu himself is now dead, but it's one of the centers where his flame burns brightly, but it really does in American sociology as a whole. If you go to your bookstore, I know there are no bookstores, but if you were to put his name into your Amazon search, 50 books would pop up, some by him and many, many about him. But the other thing that's happened only in the last 5 or 10 years is a huge number of papers in the major sociology journals and an enormous amount of research about morality, right? So people are thinking again very hard about what people internalize, really about the nature of socialization. And we are learning new things that sort of blow many of our old models of this out of the water. So I'm going to try to talk about what I think the issues are in this area. Now, I'll just point out, I've got these 3 debates. I think they clarify things a little bit, but if you imagined, and I'm not going to actually do this, that we created a 3-by-3 table so that you could actually combine these in any pattern, right? So you could believe that socialization, and I'll explain what these mean, but that it was unitary but superficial and malleable. Or you could believe that it was modular but deep but malleable, or enduring, superficial, unitary. There would be a large number of different possibilities. I don't know if it's 9, or I have to do my binomial, I got to practice again on the, whatever that is, binomial distribution or something. But anyway, a lot of possibilities. Things would get very, very confusing. So I hope to keep things clear by using these, but I want to forewarn you that it is not the case that if you decide things are unitary, you're also going to have to believe they're deep, and you're also going to have to believe they're enduring. That's the old way of thinking about things, which is that there's a unitary self. You internalize things deeply early in childhood, and they last a lifetime. And that's socialization, And then there are other things that are in bits and pieces, which is what modular means. They are relatively superficial, like your hairstyle or your style of dress, and you would recognize that when you're a student, you look like schlachavatic, as we say, and then when you become a professional, you'll wear a nice suit and or whatever the current style is, and that'll be very dependent on what the style is, not on some deeply internalized thing, and therefore very changeable. But that easy idea that those things just go together, that's what's come under question and required a whole bunch of new ways of thinking. Okay, so now unitary versus modular. What is the issue here? And the issue really is whether the person, the individual self, and the term you use would matter a lot, as we'll see, is shaped in some relatively coherent way, so that, yes, you have different experiences, you have experiences in your family, in school, in this and that, but they all sort of reinforce each other to create one basic kind of person you are, and that might be a combination of your experience, your capacities, whatever skills you have, whatever goals you learn, but that by the time you get formed, at whatever age you might imagine that really happens, for reasons that'll become clear later, I'm going to say 25. How many of you are over 25? Very few. Okay, you're lucky. Yeah, it's very tough. Now, I really think that's true. Okay, and I'll explain why. All right, so is the person, the self, and again, a relatively coherent unitary thing, or are human beings essentially modular? And again, I use this example of a computer's software to talk about, in some ways, what the evolution of human capacities is. And clearly, a lot of things are modular, meaning there are lots of different pieces, and you can use different ones at different times. So your computer holds lots of different software that does totally different things, that isn't unitary, it's modular. And so I don't want to introduce a weird technical term. You could use a term more like fragmented or partial or incoherent or something, but all those contain a kind of negative valence. And I don't think that's right. I think actually the idea that people might have many diverse capacities, they deploy them differently in different situations. They have some parts of themselves that are not particularly available to conscious regulation, and different parts of people come out in different situations. Now here, I didn't write this down, and again, don't want to, I would say, don't take notes, just think about it. An older version of this modular notion is actually the work of Sigmund Freud, right? Where he said, well, people have a conscious and they have an unconscious. And so you suddenly blurt out something you didn't mean to say, or do something that you thought you shouldn't do, or much more often, for reasons you don't quite understand, make the same bad choice this time that you made the last time, even though you swore to yourself you wouldn't do it again, right? The same bad choice of a loved one, the same delaying your paper to the last minute, even though you know it's such a bad idea. But there's some other part of you, right, that's resisting writing that paper. Maybe it's not even you're busy. This is my own psyche I'm talking about now. There are things that I know I should do, that I want to do, that I consciously believe I ought to do and am going to do, that at some other level I really must not want to do. And so it takes huge amounts of psychic energy to overcome the part of me that doesn't want to do it, with the part of me that does want to do it. So modular is not as weird. I'm just saying that that's a plausible story also. So I think the difficulty is we tend to experience ourselves as unitary. There really aren't three Ann Swidlers standing up here. And even if, Ann Swidler, wow. And if you see my office door, my husband discovered this. I was very thrilled. I turned out to be the only Ann Swidler, if you look at Social Security name data, in the United States, and I would bet on the planet. So, kind of a funny, ugly name, so no one else happens to be blessed with that exact name. There's no more. Well, Swindler, it's not a good last name. Ann I love, but Swidler, and my children don't have it, and yeah, probably so. There are other ones out there, but not many. Okay, so I said I would still be Ann Swidler. There isn't another one standing next to me, but actually, that's a kind of odd thing, because Ann Swidler is a unified social reality, right? It's an identity that's defined by other people, and I could inhabit the same body, but escape the criminal gang that's chasing me by withdrawing a lot of cash from my bank account, dyeing my hair black, getting a nose job, and disappearing into the southern wilds where I would work at a local, actually I can't, I have a tremor, so I definitely can't work at the coffee shop, but I could work at the local 10-cent store in some small southern town. And I actually have a southern accent that could come back in no time. So I could be hiding out in the Kentucky coal mining district, claiming to be from Knoxville, where I actually did grow up. Okay, so very active fantasy life. All I'm saying is, that this idea that we have a unitary self, we certainly have a unitary body, right? There's some unitary aspect of us for sure. And that one, even if you injure it or something bad happens to it or it breaks down, as it surely will, it's still you in that sense. And in fact, it carries your history with it, right? So you broke your toe 10 years ago, or you broke your arm in high school and it's crooked. And again, unless you go do major surgery, it's still going to be crooked. Or your toes that curl under are still going to curl under, or your whatever. So the history of things that happen to you are there, and your memory, well, that has a lot of continuity as well, right? So your parents, your aunt and uncle, your childhood home, although we now know that a lot of stuff people remember may not actually have happened, it turns out to be true. And of course, a great deal that happened you have no memory of, and you should save as many pieces of paper and emails and stuff, because I have done this. So in my era, you wrote letters. And so my mother saved all my letters from, I don't know, camp, and I have letters to a girlfriend and letters I wrote to my husband before we got married, and lots of letters. I go back and read them, and I cannot remember ever having been the person who wrote those letters. It's not that I can't remember the content. Of course I can't. I mean, most of it was trivial or whatever. But I can't remember inhabiting the psyche of that person. And it wasn't that it was anything so weird. It's just not, it's not who I feel I am and have always been. So unity is very important. It is certainly true that we think of ourselves as unitary. We have a very strong psychic experience of ourselves as unitary. We narrate a history, which is the only one we can, unless we're sort of sociopaths who are con artists who are making up ourselves literally minute by minute. We pretty much stick to, a gradually evolving view of what our childhoods were like, who we knew and loved as children, and that there's a lot of continuity there. But there's also a lot of evidence for modular. And modular would suggest that we have many different capacities, many different potential selves, let me put it that way, many different skills that may be deployed, or deployed is a very conscious word that sounds like you intend to do things, but they might get triggered in very different situations. And here I want you to think back to the Milgram experiments. There was a very powerful, very, very weird situation that if those people who participated in that experiment had never had the misfortune to get recruited into a study in a university, they would never, they would have gone through their entire lives utterly convinced that they couldn't behave that way, right? And they never would have. It's just absolutely clear. There'd be no situation in which ever would they ever, never, ever, 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 never do such a thing. But they did. So something, not necessarily something they had no anticipation of in a situation, could induce or evoke or force aspects of their whatever, psyches or experience or socialization, to lead to behaviors that really are not well predicted by a kind of version in which the self you narrate about yourself is just what that's you. You're unitary. That you wouldn't do that, you know. And I'm not arguing that this one isn't real. I think it is real. And thank goodness. My. But it might turn out that there are huge parts of human behavior that actually behave in this more modular way. And one of the debates that comes under this issue of unitary versus modular is a debate I've been involved in, which is the old sociological models assume that both individuals, but much more important, groups of people, like the values of Western culture, or the values of Protestantism, or the values of Confucianism, or the values of, whatever, shape whole cultural, whole communities' trajectories. Ethnic group values and so forth, and that if you knew those values, you'd know how people were going to behave. And I took another side in the debate where I talked about people as having a toolkit of different capacities, and including values is one of those things, but I talked more about, and I'll talk about this later, styles, skills, and habits as being important. That issue is not resolved. There's a lot of work that I would say is on my side. I've sort of modified my own thinking a little bit over time, but there's also a lot of work on the other side that suggests a somewhat different model than the one I suggested. So all I'm saying is this is really a hot debate. You can get published in Sociology tomorrow by having a better answer to this question. In fact, one of the really hotshot young people in the field has been publishing exactly on this issue. And there's a lot of evidence from the brain that would suggest a more modular image of the human being. So now I'm going to plunge a little bit into something that is definitively not my field, which is brain and behavior. And so, here we go. But keep those three debates in your mind for a minute. Oh, I was going to go through the other. All right, let me go through the third. Sorry, I forgot about this. Then I'm going to go to the brain. Okay, the third of these debates is deep versus superficial. And again, there's always some assumption that if things are really deeply internalized, they will be enduring, and deep might include things from socialization, like deeply internalized values and motives and identities, that's what gets taught to you. It might also include deep things like your basic temperament and your whatever you're born with, right? Could include biological things that are very deep, versus superficial things. So styles, skills, surfaces like what you wear and so forth. So again, if I dye my hair black, wear lots of makeup, get all my clothes at Kmart, and start talking with a Southern accent, or with the country, actually it's not really a Southern, the country accent I grew up with, where you really did say things like, I'm going to water the clothes and water the flowers and iron the clothes. That version. And I couldn't say yes without two syllables, yes. And so that, you know, would I really be the same person if I lived that life for a few years? Unclear. So there's that, and then I got to go to the third one, sorry. And enduring versus malleable. So again, what are the parts of the person that are consistent and that presumably influence other things, that keep people going, that make you do the same thing in different situations, or that predict from, you know, this year or this month what you'll do next year or next month? So what are the consistent parts of the individual person? And those, again, might be temperament from birth, values learned in childhood, identities, once you really consolidate an identity in young adulthood. You know, so maybe there's some point at which you decide the world is made up of selfish people and generous people. And there are going to be choices every day, and I'm going to think of myself as a generous person. And there are a lot of advantages selfish people get, but I just don't want to be that person. And that might be a very fundamental sort of, might not evolve that consciously, might be over time you would see yourself in a certain way, but that would suggest fairly continuous, enduring aspects, versus what aspects of persons shift with new experiences, new situation. This word is sets. You can't, my design sense and my, I knew this was a problem, but that word is sets. New sets of available, I should have made it red actually, and it would have shown up. Next time. I didn't think of that. Okay, new sets of available identities. So you might not become the person who was generous versus selfish until you entered a work world where the differences between people turned out to be the people who were willing to screw their colleagues in order to advance their own careers versus the people who just would not do certain things. And it might only be when you're 35 that you stop and say, whoa, wait a minute. I've been going along in my little bubble and helping my friends and, you know, going out to lunch with people, and I didn't notice that there were really these two kinds of people. And I need to think about which one of those I'm going to be, which one of those I am. So these discussions are often, what am I already and what options are there? So you're not going to be the manipulative. There's a wonderful character Sigourney Weaver plays in whatever the Meg Ryan movie is about. Anyway, she's this manipulative, sexy, older vamp. Okay, if you're, you know, never were that, if you're mousy plain, you're never going to be the manipulative, sexy vamp, actually, unless Katie Couric gets hold of you and gives you a new design and makes you up, and then maybe you can't be. But it's always what aspects of persons shift with new experiences, new situations, new sets of available identities, new social contexts. So all these sets of potential oppositions are linked. Now I'm going to turn to, I hope, what is the next slide? Evidence for modular, brain and environment. There it is. Okay, so increasingly, people who study the brain, and there is a whole subfield that's not only, so in psychology, any of you who want to be psychology majors will realize they make you learn now vast amounts of, you have to have a lot of math, you have to have biology, and this, I don't know if they do it for undergraduates, but basically it's not a field anymore where you can just go in and think about emotional problems and things like that. It really is a field that's focused around cognition, and increasingly the study of the mind involves the study of the biology of the mind. And you would think that would make everything very simple, like, oh, the brain is a machine, so we're all kind of machines. Just the opposite. The complexity that is emerging in studies of the brain is absolutely fascinating. Not simple, fascinating, and extraordinarily complex, and believe it or not, extraordinarily sociological. So social shaping is turning out to be more important because we are understanding biology better, not less important. So the old nature-nurture debate, how much are we shaped by our environment versus how much by, by our, quote, our social environment versus how much by our inherited biology, that question has been blown out of the water. You can't even ask that question anymore. And I'll try to explain why. That division, which assumes, I'm going to go back in my slides for a second. That assumes that if the thing is deep and biological, it's enduring and unitary, right? That's what that old nature-nurture debate was about. But it's turning out that biology has a lot of elements that are modular, superficial, and malleable. So, yeah, okay, now the modular. And there's a whole subfield of this field of how the brain works that also looks at evolutionary elements of this, because it turns out that the developmental aspects of the brain that emerge during biological development in utero, at birth, and through childhood into adulthood, the developmental biology of the brain, right? And the evolutionary biology of the brain turn out to partly have a lot in common. So the parts of the brain that evolved earliest turn out also to develop earliest in infancy. And one thing that's really important about this is it means that the critical age at which social influences matter are different for different parts of the brain. Do you understand what I'm saying? So if there's a part of the brain that is in a critical stage of development between conception or sometime in the uterus and age 2, then if your parents were unemployed, homeless, terrified, unsure about their futures at those ages, it may have very, very different effects on your development than if that same set of social experiences happened to your family, but happened when you were 5 or 6, or 11 or 12. Because different parts of your brain are maturing and hooking up to the social world. So remember I said there's kind of, nobody uses this language, but a language module or something like that in the brain that's kind of extra alert and open, receptive, ready to learn, from infancy to age 5 or something like that. And it's busy processing every signal from the environment that could possibly lead it to learn a language. Well, other parts of the brain turn out to be like that as well. So the evolutionary developmental understanding of the brain, which again is in its infancy, this is all very partial. Do not take this as gospel, because 20 years from now, we will know incredibly much more about these systems. Incredibly much more. But it looks as if one of the really important systems is what's called the HPA axis. It's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system. And you can think of this as the fundamental emotional stuff, and it's largely hormonal. And the thing that's studied the most right now is cortisol. You may all have heard of cortisol. It's the stress hormone. It's basically adrenaline, the thing that shoots up when you're frightened. If you fly in an airplane and you hate turbulence as I do, you get a shot of adrenaline when the plane suddenly lurches and your palms start to sweat, your heart races, right? Or somebody surprises you by tapping you on the shoulder, or jumps out at you on a street on a dark night. All of those are, and you psych yourself up for the SATs. It can be any of the above, or your athletes are extremely skilled at manipulating their hormonal systems to charge themselves up. They know they need a lot of adrenaline to drive their bodies for the next 2 hours in the way they're going to have to do to succeed in a sport. And that's why mental preparation for most serious athletes is vastly more important than physical, or it's as important as physical preparation. I had a student who was a superb golfer, and she apparently said 100% of what made her as good as she was a Berkeley person, some national champion, but what made her good was the way she could concentrate, that she could exclude everything else and then put her body and her mind in a kind of trance state in which she could do what she needed to do. Okay, so your hormonal system is extremely important. It kicks in very early, and especially important, it regulates these basic hormones that manage stress. So the screaming baby, the sort of, if you want to think of it as, it's a very primitive part of the brain. It's very old in evolutionary terms. It's very basic. And they know quite a bit about it because you can study it in animals very well. So, and you can study it, again, cortisol is this weird thing, and I don't do this at all, but it's very easy to measure. And you can study levels of the stress hormone in people because you can study it in saliva. So you can give a newborn infant a little Q-tip soaked in sugar, and the baby goes, and whoop, you can measure the cortisol. But apparently it's extremely easy. It's actually cheap to do. The problem is cortisol levels vary a lot during the day. They vary, and it's kind of unstable. So a lot of sociologists now are starting to add this to a survey. So you can actually ask people to suck on essentially a lollipop or something, or put a piece of tissue paper on their tongue for a second, and you can get a cortisol measure while you're surveying people about their parents, say, or about their childhood, or about some stressful event, or about that. But so far, this is not perfected because people don't know what this means. Apparently your cortisol is different at 8 a.m. than it is at 10 a.m. So if you're interviewing some people in the afternoon, some in the morning. So right now we're in the garbage stage of this as a serious research tool. But it is going to be. This is really going to be important. Okay, and what they are, all right, and so I won't say more about it right now because I have something very important to say, but I'll just say it's the basic system that regulates arousal, anxiety, fear, and calm, the kind of ability to come back to normal. That's a very, so it's sort of the hormonal baseline that regulates a lot of our experience. The second system that kicks in early infancy is what's called the serotonergic system. And here I say serotonin is a neurotransmitter, so it's one of these complex molecules that keeps one of your neurons in touch with the other neurons. So all the little links between neurons are synapses, and the serotonin is sort of the messenger that goes between one neuron and another and keeps your brain working. And we understand a fair amount about the importance of serotonin, and there are other, dopamine and a few other very important neurotransmitters that are involved in having your brain communicate adequately with itself and with your muscles and so forth. That is also the system that can be manipulated with drugs like Prozac. Those are serotonin reuptake inhibitors. That's what they do, is essentially force your brain not to destroy serotonin as fast as it normally does. That's how they work. So all those Zoloft and Prozac and blah, 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 all the antidepressant drugs are basically manipulate that system. That system turns out to be very important in infant attachment. So all this business about when your baby's born, you've got to look deep into its eyes, and you've got to, and well-attached infants are willing to toddle off from their parent and only come back when something scary happens, whereas poorly attached infants cling and are too afraid to explore the environment and so forth. You'll hear a little bit of cynicism in my voice, because there's one thing about all scientists, but certainly social scientists, is we read the moral stories that make sense in our culture into our scientific work. So sort of good mothers, and bad mothers lead to poorly attached children. And I'm a little, I think this is really important, and it's been studied a lot in monkeys, and it's been studied a lot in rats and things like that. So something about this second system is really important. And one way to think about it is that attachment opens the channels that allow social information and social experience to flow in. It doesn't make you a certain kind of person, it makes you a person who can absorb social information well, right? But that is a second very, very important system, and it clearly works in some part of early childhood. So we do know that, for instance, babies who are taken care of in orphanages, so they're very well taken care of physically. They're fed and they're nurtured and so forth, but they do not have any consistent emotional interactions. Some actually die. There's a syndrome called failure to thrive, and it's a physiological syndrome in which babies kind of waste away. And it's like if they don't have some possibility of attachment, they can't make it. On the other hand, it's also a hugely resilient system, and I'm going to tell you a quick, I'm going to allot a little minute here for a story about this. I read a book it was actually by the wife of the person who at the time was the editor of Rutgers University Press, and they had adopted a baby from, I think it was Guatemala, but anyway, some Latin American country. And so his wife flew down there. For some reason, he couldn't be with her. They had negotiated with this orphanage over a long period of time, and yes, and this was the baby, and this was her name, and so on and so forth. They were going to adopt Teresa. She goes to the orphanage, and they hand her this baby that is supposed to be 6 months old. It is emaciated. It cannot keep its head up. It's too weak to keep its head up. It is yellow. It looks like it's going to die in 1 second. And she, on the one hand, has been this is her child. She's kind of connected this baby from a distance. This is the child that's going to be her baby. And on the other hand, she's thinking, this is, this baby, sick, terrible, terrible, terrible. So she's very upset, doesn't know what to do, takes the baby back to her hotel room, tries desperately during the night to find a way to feed it. Of course, she doesn't have breast milk, so she uses formula and, you know, giving the baby with a dropper little bits of milk during the night and so forth. And then by the morning, she's up all night. This, you know, this is the child she's going to have for the next, you know, if she lives long enough, 50 years or something. So she really is just terrified at what, you know, retarded, this, that. She has no idea what's going on here. She decides she has to take the baby back, that this is just not something she can undertake. She has no idea what's going on. And so she holds the baby, takes back to the orphanage, and when she starts to hand the baby back, this baby grabs her blouse, just like that. And at that point, she cannot. She just can't. I mean, whatever it is in her, the sense of responsibility, the sense that this is meant to be her baby, whatever kicks in, and she cannot give the baby back. And so she keeps it. Well, it turns out that infant was suffering from this failure to thrive because this orphanage, which was run by very nice, well-meaning middle and upper class ladies, would take the babies home on the weekend. So the babies were taken care of by, you know, whatever professionals during the week, and then different well-meaning ladies would take them home and then bring them back on Monday morning. And they'd again be left, and these babies were having their attachment system completely disrupted. Completely disrupted. And this, so the ending of this story, which is just amazing, is that she takes this baby home with a secure attachment. The baby starts to thrive. And those of you who, there's probably nobody from New York in this room, but that girl ends up going to Dalton, which is one of the, becoming a super athlete, a super brain, getting into great college. I mean, she just ends up being great. So on the one hand, it shows the amazing level of resilience that that infant, with that attachment system that severely disrupted, that I think she weighed something like 7 pounds at 6 months old, could become not only a physically healthy adult, but an emotionally healthy adult. Now, these Romanian kids, I think, who have this, and again, probably quite variable from one child to another. We don't know what these processes are, but this is the system that is operating. And there's probably a lot more aspects of it than serotonin to create these possibilities of attachment. Okay, and then the third system is the prefrontal cortex. And this is the part that makes us human beings. Actually, no other species has the kind of prefrontal cortex we do. And again, I shouldn't say no other species because I actually don't know what the very, you know, the high-level apes and the whales and the porpoises have by way of a prefrontal cortex. But I think the current thinking is that consciousness, in our sense, which is heavily dependent, of course, on language as well, may exist only in human beings. And anyway, this is a very, very late evolution. So one of my points here is the modular nature of this. That is, we've got a primitive, hormone-regulating, kind of very low on the brainstem thing going. We've got a somewhat less primitive attachment thing going. And then late in evolution, we've got this both rational, conscious, linguistic, and decision-making thing that's sort of trying to master and provide some unity to all the rest of it, right? So just, if people are starting to get dementia, right, and that you may have a grandparent or a parent, I hope not, who's heading in that direction, or sometimes I think I myself am heading in that direction, when I lose my temper in a faculty meeting and say something and I walk out and I think, I shouldn't have said that. I knew better than that. I was thinking it, that's for sure. But why did I say it? It's called disinhibition, when you can't control your, you know, lots of us are thinking things, but we normally don't say them or do them. And if you stop being able to control that, that means your prefrontal cortex isn't working very well. And that's the rational, thinking, decision-making part of the brain. They do not do experiments on this, so they don't understand it as well because they can't do, there are no animal models for it. You can't do it in rats. Right? But they are learning a huge amount more about it. So this is the system that gives behavioral self-regulation, including advanced cognitive facilities of logic and emotion, attention regulation, so should I pay attention to this or to that, and the development of a self-aware identity. So those are all part of this prefrontal cortex, and the new discovery is this, that during adolescence, starting, again, these are averages around age 15, human beings develop huge numbers of new neurons. It is not true that all the brain cells you ever will have, you developed at birth, and you will never have any more. You get lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of new ones with lots and lots of possibilities for new connections, and no wonder adolescence is confusing. It's exciting. You can learn more, think more, get excited about more, that, and this process then of, it's very confusing. It's literally confusing because your brain is really exploding with new possibilities, and there are too many of them. So what also happens during this period is what is called neural sculpting, which is the synapses that don't get used sort of die off, the nerve cells that don't get activated. And it's not that you want to just be in a frenzy all the time. Actually, I think you want to get a reasonable amount of sleep. It probably does mean, and this is not on the test, that doing drugs is really a bad idea. Like really an extremely bad idea, a very, very bad idea, an incredibly bad idea, because this is the period when your brain is going to take the shape that it will have for the rest of your life. So I would say, do not get drunk. To drink is, do not get smashed. Don't do it. No, this is the only brain you're going to have, and you are shaping it now. And it's a very resilient thing, so you woke up after a hangover and you felt okay? Okay. But you do not know what you were doing to your brain. So most of you don't do this anyway. We know this from data. I'm relieved to say, and the ones of you who are here on Friday morning for sure don't do it, because you were not out drinking on Thursday night. But look at the empty seats around you. Ooh, terrible. So don't do it. Don't do it, because this is the brain, and it is proliferating all this stuff, and then neural sculpting and pruning, and that continues to about age 25. So it is actually true that most of you, not all of you, but most of you, will have a lot of confusion or a sense of both excitement and pain, and that is very normal, and things do get a little easier. They actually get easier, I think. I love being an adult. I did not enjoy being a kid, so you might, I hope for you that you're enjoying being a kid, but I think life gets better. But it really is true that these neural processes, which are both a huge opportunity for you, learn as much as you can, use your brains, do good things with them, but that process continues to about age 25. Okay, now, there is also a lot of evidence for a more unitary self, and I've got a really important point I want to get to. All right, and I'll just say that we now understand a little better that that people make decisions in a kind of global way that is somehow intuitive, that does seem to represent something that has a certain continuity. So if you ask people to think about things, they might make a different kind of decision, but if you ask them to make a quick, intuitive judgment, there is some evidence that that type of moral judgment or whatever might have quite a bit of continuity and influence on behavior over time. All right, I got to get to my last point. I'll come back to this one, which is the new research frontier is brain-environment interactions that show that this biological substrate is heavily socially malleable. And this is the most fascinating stuff of all. So, malleable, highly malleable. That's all I said. the biological can be changed. And one of the most dramatic examples of that is that this stress regulation system, this HPA axis that regulates your cortisol, it turns out that experience can change that system by actually altering the DNA. Because this thing called a methyl group, which is an organic molecule, attaches itself to the outside of the DNA and blocks the expression of some genes. This is part of all normal development. This is how one cell becomes a skin cell, because it blocks the expression of the parts of it that would have made it a heart cell, and the lung cell is different. But it also turns out that stress in utero and in infancy has been shown in animals to permanently alter the ways they process stress, making them either hyper-stressed all the time where they never can calm down, or incapable of responding to stress. Think your cool killer who can hold a steady gun and murder people without feeling anything. And both of those can be the result of highly stressful experiences in utero, and some of those changes may be inherited. Okay, sorry.